Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Identity Insights by Indicio. Today, I'm joined by James Schulte, who's the VP of Business Development at Indicio, to discuss some of the interesting government use cases for decentralized identity and why governments are interested in adopting this new technology. So thanks so much for taking some time to speak with us today, James. I'm particularly excited to talk to you because adoption at the government level tends to really influence how most technologies are used. So where have you been seeing governments interested in verifiable credentials?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first off, thanks for having me today. Excited to talk about this too. There's been a lot going on in the public sector's interest in decentralized identity technology. So back to your question, where we're seeing governments take interest. I think one area to really watch right now is in digital wallets for citizen use. So for example, over in the EU at the moment, um, the uh, the initiative for the European Digital Identity Wallet that's being spearheaded by the European Commission. Um, Essentially, they're trying to create the framework and guidelines that makes it possible to store electronic forms of identification in a person's mobile device or on their machine, for example, making it possible for them to take an electronic form of ID and use that to do whatever they would like to do with it. For example, opening up a bank account, filing a tax return, proving their age, to purchase something that's age restricted. It could be onboarding onto some sort of digital service that requires proof of identity, claiming of a medical prescription, for example. Lots of different ways it can be applied. The idea is that this identity credential or this identity wallet that holds these credentials, that they would be recognized throughout anywhere in the Eurozone. So that's a big deal when a consortium or a group of member countries that large is pushing towards that. So highly recommend keeping an eye on where that goes. I think they have a target date for later 2022 to agree on the framework, IATIS 2.0. And then I believe they're getting ready to start some pilot projects with that. So it's really exciting. It has a lot of really cool implications. Another area that I'd say that's interesting to watch is, for example, the Canadian federal government. They recently released their paper about the Digital Ambition 2022 is what it was titled, which essentially sets out their long-term vision for the Canadian government to advance digital service delivery. And one of the main pillars of that paper talked about the need for the government to create a fast and straightforward way to prove digital identity claims. Canada obviously has been a pioneer in the verifiable credential space at the provincial level. You have several different provincial governments working together and also working on their own use cases where citizens can use verifiable credentials for all sorts of things. Government of Ontario, for example, with the Ontario Digital ID program, working to make it possible for citizens to hold ID on their digital devices to do similar things like the European wallet. So yeah, some really exciting things to keep an eye on. One more that just came to mind was back in January, a memo coming from the executive office of the president of the United States sent to the heads of executive departments and agencies. And the subject line of that memo was moving the US government toward zero trust cybersecurity principles. What's really interesting about that is that concept of never trust, but always verify. And that's exactly what verifiable credentials make possible. So you see governments moving in the direction of real application of credentials to not only make citizens' lives easier through portable digital credentials, but also having it become a matter of national security. So yeah, lots of really interesting things going on at the moment.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. So I know, right, sometimes you're actually having these conversations with governments, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the use cases governments, typically ask you questions about and kind of what they want to know when they're looking at, verifiable credentials.
All right, yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say one of the first things they ask about is why verifiable credentials as opposed to the current systems that they used that are more traditional centralized systems for identity management for citizens or for any sort of public registry of businesses or entities. So establishing the real value for the government to use that. I mean, for example, just imagine what you could do, with a digital wallet where you could have your own digital credentials that you could take to other places to be instantly verified. So, for example, like what they're doing in the European Union, um, you know, simply making simple everyday transactions even easier, removing friction, making it easier to open up bank accounts, as I had mentioned, or being able to access services in a matter of seconds rather than minutes. Cutting through bureaucracy and paperwork and doing it in a more streamlined process that saves the government time. It creates for a better experience for citizens. It creates more accessibility for those who, maybe are traditionally left out of certain service considerations because of the burdens involved with verifying identity in traditional ways. So there's a lot of implications for citizens and how it can improve the quality of life and their ability to access the services they need. And then on the commercial side, on the other side where governments have particular interest in how can it benefit their economy or their national infrastructure, there was a report recently put out by the United Nations Center for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business that I think had a really good point about this. They put out a white paper recently about verifiable credentials for cross-border trade. And there was a quote in there where they likened verifiable identity to a national asset, similar to roads or electricity grids. The ability to verify identity is just as important, enabling people to get from point A to point B digitally in a digital services sense. And some of the examples that they had mentioned were registering a bank account, and for businesses being able to enroll a new supplier or a customer, or even to register their business in the first place. Being able to make quicker payments or send digital invoices in a more trustworthy manner. So I thought that report was definitely worth reading, and has a lot of implications for nations' economies, simply being able to do things quicker in a more trustworthy way. So
what are some of the concerns that governments have when they're looking at implementing the technology?
So first, having an understanding of the privacy implications of the technology, how can it actually preserve the privacy of the users of the digital IDs? How does it satisfy the requirements of the government? How does it satisfy regulatory components while respecting the privacy of the individual? They also want to know about the ability of the technology to scale, obviously. If it's serving as a piece of infrastructure for public use, it has to be scalable and robust. They also want to know, or I guess I should say, they're looking to avoid vendor lock-in. As often as possible, they're looking to not be stuck with a third-party platform. For example, here in the United States, the IRS, recently was receiving a lot of scrutiny for using a third-party provider for identity verification that had a lot of privacy concerns that came along with that and made a lot of people nervous. So governments, whenever possible, try to stay away from that and are really prefer open source work, in the sense that there's a large selection of vendors or providers or open standards or open source repos where community collaboration can benefit or act as a beneficial thing for the implementation of that technology. So not being stuck with a single provider, for example. I'd say another concern that they have is being able to properly communicate what verifiable credentials are and what they are not, or what decentralized identity is and what it's not. When people hear about a national identity program or an identity registry, they naturally get nervous. They instantly go to this Orwellian mindset of, oh no, I'm going to be tracked, and there's going to be mass surveillance with this. And in the past, stuff like that has happened where federal or government ID programs have been misused. And this is where decentralized identity really brings value. And I think when communicated properly, helps people to understand that this is something that can actually protect you from that. The ability to selectively disclose information about yourself, or retain information, or decide where you take that information to, all while being able to satisfy those regulatory requirements. So it's finding that sweet spot in the middle of protecting an individual's privacy. When governments are approaching decentralized identity projects or initiatives, there's typically two sides to it. There's the technological stakeholders on the inside who are figuring out what technology is going to be used and how it's going to be used. And then there's the public-facing side responsible for communicating the technology to the public, making sure that all of the stakeholders are on the same page as to what decentralized identity is and what it isn't. Has a large correlation how successful the project is. So that's, I guess, I would say a summary of what we've experienced working with governments in that sense.
So are there any use cases that Indicio has worked on that you can talk about specifically, and maybe give some examples of what you've been talking about?
So yeah, one use case that I can talk about that's been publicly mentioned has been our work with the government of Aruba, for example. Starting with the Happy Traveler card that we worked to develop with CETA and the government of Aruba back at the beginning of the pandemic. The initial challenge that Aruba was facing was obviously the sudden drop off in tourism to the island. And Aruba's national economy is very reliant on tourism. I believe it's 98% of their GDP. So having tourists and travelers come to the island is critical for for daily life there. Another challenge was using PDFs or JPEGs or pictures of proof of vaccination or proof of a negative COVID test. They were finding that upwards of 60% of those provided documents had been falsified or were fraudulent or counterfeit, for example. And that posed a huge risk, because if you had a traveler come in who was actually COVID positive, and there was an outbreak on the island, that could really bring things to a halt and be simply said disastrous. So they needed a way to verify that health data, and that's where verifiable credentials came in. The ability to verify that the information presented by the traveler was truly from the trusted source or the authorized source, and that the information that was within that digital credential had also not been tampered with and was verifiable. So that was essentially the first use case. Moving beyond that, I think the upcoming work has some large implications on travel in general. The work on the digital travel credential based on the ICAO standard. And this is really exciting because this is where we start to see traditional digital ID documents used for travel transition into completely digital versions. So the passport, for example, becoming a verifiable credential that you can use to satisfy those identity requirements at the arrival location, or being able to prove certain identity aspects about yourself even before your trip to a location. So that removes a lot of friction from the travel process, and then being able to use that credential beyond the airport, using it for hotel check-in, for car rental, for example. And because the passport is obviously a highly trusted document that isn't just used for travel, there are other organizations that would see value in using that level of trusted identity for other things. Again, for example, at a gas station with an age-restricted purchase, using your digital travel credential for the purchase of something else. So a lot of really interesting use cases that can spin off of that. So we're excited for the ongoing work in that area, and we're excited to talk more about updates as they come out.
Well, it looks like we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining me today, James. If you want to learn more about some use cases for decentralized identity, I'll have a link to our website below where we have some success stories, and you can learn about, other areas where you can use a verifiable credential you might not have thought of. If you're interested in decentralized identity in general and would like to learn more, please be sure to subscribe to the channel as we'll continue to bring you some more educational content. And if you have any questions or specific topics that you'd like for us to cover, please be sure to leave a comment below and we will make sure to address them. Thanks again, James. If someone would be interested in learning more about the technology, it sounded like you had some good articles. Would you have any recommendations for them?
Yeah, as mentioned, I highly recommend checking out that white paper that was put out by the United Nations Center for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business. I thought it did a really good job of showcasing how credentials can be used to speed up critical processes. So also, please reach out to our team at Indicio. We're always excited to talk about use cases and talk about how you can apply those to your business challenges.